Brian, and thank you all for coming today. I want to start by just saying that technically I'm here just as a citizen and not as an official representative of NOAA. I'm here on my own time, and all of my opinions that I might put forth today are my own and not part of NOAA or in any official capacity. So let me find, I've lost the clicker already. So here's my title. It's not really just limited to dams. I'll go into that a bit more, but a lot more about water management in general in the water-stressed West. An alternative title. This quote has often been attributed to Mark Twain, but it's never really been verified. And those of you that have attended other talks in this series may have already seen this. It really rings true that water is really a big deal, and in modern times it's often sort of referred to as our next oil when it comes to natural resources. So I'm going to start with this slide here of the U.S. and the average annual precipitation. You folks out here on the East Coast, this is somewhere in the 40 to 100 inches per year rainfall. You get plenty of rain out here, but as you move west, you can see the average annual rainfall really decreases unless you're in the Pacific Northwest up around Seattle. But now I'm going to zoom into California itself, and never know which side to point to here. This is Southern California, and it's really desert. Northern California, way up north, there is a lot of rain, and certainly throughout the Sierra Mountain range, there's a lot of rain. But the important issue is here is this is where the water is in the state. This is where the water falls, and this is where the people are. And this is sort of where the whole story starts. This is a graph of the average of 10 years of precipitation, or over 10 years of precipitation for Los Angeles in blue and Beirut in red. This gives you an idea that it really is a low rainfall area. And I'm from Northern California, and before I want to make sure I don't come across as this is some sort of Northern California, Southern California thing, because it really isn't. This is San Francisco now in red, which is not a whole heck of a lot more rainfall in San Francisco than there is in Los Angeles. So this is really it's really about the distribution of water and where the people are. So here is the California Central Valley. There's San Francisco there, right here. Los Angeles is down off the screen, so I've sort of narrowed it in. You're not seeing the whole state here, but you are seeing the massive Central Valley. And this is a huge watershed where all the snow melt and rainfall from the Sierras comes through these rivers here into these two major tributaries. There's the Sacramento River to the north here and the San Joaquin to the south. And all the water from that enormous watershed is filtered through this inverted river delta here, through the San Francisco Bay and out into the ocean. And so this is a ton of water, most of it coming from the Sacramento River. At least 3/4 of the water is coming from the north. And this is also the pathway for salmon. This is, they're tightly coupled with the flow of water. And in order to explain this, I'll go over the salmon life cycle. They have a somewhat complex life cycle that uses a lot of habitat. So in an ideal world, they lay their eggs up in these mountain streams and cold, clean water up in the mountains. And they have these various life stages. These are called aoven that hang around after they hatch out of the eggs. And then these juvenile stages called fry rear in the rivers, and they grow. And then they continue moving downstream to where they get into the sort of brackish water of the estuary, the delta. And that's where they go through this amazing physiological transformation, where they go from being a freshwater fish to a saltwater fish. You know, if you took any other freshwater fish and threw them in saltwater, they would die. But these guys have the ability to adapt and become a saltwater fish, where then they go into the ocean. And these aren't to scale. The adults are massive. They can be up to 1 meter long, and the ocean is where all the food is. So they go into the ocean, they eat a bunch of food, they get really big, and this is what we like about them because they're big and we like how they taste. And so they're very popular sport and commercial fish. But then, after they get big, after a few years, they come right back again, and they go right back through the bay, through the delta, up the river to their spawning grounds where they were born. And it's a pretty long journey, can be pretty brutal, and then they spawn, and within a few weeks they die. So that's the life of a salmon. There's the male and the female at the spawning site. So that, as I said, was in an ideal world, or maybe the pre-Western colonization of California world. Now it looks a bit different. And these mark the locations of some massive dams that are they're called the rim dams because they're on the edge of the Sierra Nevadas. And they have blocked the fish from accessing that ancestral spawning habitat. And they play a lot of important roles in our society. They store water instead of it just being this flood of water that comes out every spring. They can store it for use throughout all the summer. They have hydroelectric generation. They do an amazing job of flood management. These are all important things. Our state capital, Sacramento, is right about there. And before they put in all these dams, it would flood fairly often. And if you happen to live in that sort of flood zone, dams would be a very important thing to you. So they do serve an important purpose, but they also have a pretty significant impact on salmon. Another area that is pretty critical, that's an example, these things are massive. They're too big to build ladders for the fish to go around, and so they're very effective in blocking the fish passage. Another big issue is the pumps that are located in the South Delta here. And what these things do is they collect water from the Delta and they pump it into these canals and move it to Southern California, to other parts of the Central Valley for agricultural purposes. Here's a picture of what one of these artificial rivers looks like. They also move it to other parts of Northern California, so it's not just a Northern California, Southern California thing. But as you can guess, and these is huge amounts of water that they're moving. As you can guess, that could have some environmental impacts on the ecosystem of that delta. And the delta itself, this is zooming in. So it's an inverted delta. Most river deltas you might think of, it's where a river comes out of the mountains, comes down to the ocean, and sort of spreads out into these channels as it goes into the ocean. This is inverted in that the ocean is actually over here. It's not a great map, but the water's flowing from the north, from the south, and somewhat from the east through this enormous wetlands. And this is a recreation of what it looked like in the 1800s. And then out to the ocean. And so it's a sort of fan shape that would flood every time there was a major amounts of water coming down. And this was exceptional habitat for a whole suite of species. All these little channels make great rearing habitat for salmon. And this is what it looks like today. This is now all the sort of grayish tan areas is mostly agricultural areas. There's been a lot of development. There's little bits of wetland in there, but it's only something like 5% of what it was historically. And what is blue, the water that's still there, are highly channelized to move water through as efficiently and quickly as possible so there isn't flooding. So all these levees and dikes were built, and the area was, all the water was pumped out so that it could make some very productive agricultural land. But it's nothing like what it used to be. Let's see here. So now looking at what it looks like now today, this is what the general pattern of the water flow would be as it's coming from the south and the east and the north. But when you turn those pumps on in the southern part of the delta, where you can see where they're going in down here, as I said, they're very strong, and it changes the water flow. So that you're getting this sort of sucking from the southern delta to fill these pumps. And in some cases, the distributaries and the channels running towards that actually flow backwards. when the pumps are going on. Instead of flowing out to the ocean, they're moving backwards. And that's an oversimplification because it's a heavily tidally influenced system. So the tides are moving water in and out constantly. But overall, those pumps significantly change the hydrodynamics of the system. And that red arrow now is to represent a huge potential problem with saltwater intrusion. As those pumps are moving water out, salt water from the San Francisco Bay is starting to creep in further and further. And then when you get a year like this year, where we're coming off a couple of years of drought, and there's less water coming in to keep that salt water out, it starts moving in further and further. And it's really critical this year, to the point where they're taking some rather drastic measures. They've already started to cut back on the amount of water they're pumping out. But if that salt water comes all the way in and starts getting pumped into the canals, I mean, there's no point in pumping salt water for municipal use or ag use. It's a huge problem. And then what is a big looming threat is levee failure. These levees are old, and one earthquake away from this happening, where a levee breaks and all the water goes flooding into one of these areas that are below sea level now due to subsidence and these long-term changes. And if that was to happen, then salt water could potentially come rushing in. They would have to shut off the pumps. It could be months until this water supply is restored. So this is a huge concern. Could have rather significant economic and other consequences. So as I said, this is a highly altered delta ecosystem for migrating salmon, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, but also delta smelt, which is a very important endangered species in that system. So what can we do to prevent this sort of catastrophic failure of water supply and potentially protect these species that are trying to move through this system without the pumps altering their migrations or actually being entrained in the pumps? And so our governor, Jerry Brown, this has been in the works for a lot longer than he's been governor, but they're thinking of this alternative conveyance, which is essentially a tunnel, not essentially, it is a tunnel, where they take the water straight from the river, the big river, the Sacramento River, tunnel it under the delta and go straight to those pumps. So you got main line of fresh water to their pumping source at a cost of, and this is probably pretty conservative, $15 to $20 billion. And the interesting part of this story, and this is called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And part of that 15 to 20 billion involves habitat restoration within the delta to return things as much as possible to their actually goes back to the gold rush, where things really started to change to those conditions. So it was introduced by Jerry Brown in 2012, although, as I said, it's been in the works for a lot longer. If anyone is interested in reading about it, you're welcome to go online and download the BDCP draft. It's 32,000 pages of fascinating reading material. There's a lot of cool stuff in there, but that is an indication of just what a big deal this is. It took 32,000 pages just for the draft of what is going to go into this project. And so Jerry Brown introduced this in 2012. He's the oldest governor ever of the state of California. Now, this has come up before, 30 years ago, in 1982, when Jerry Brown, then the youngest governor of California, he did a lot in between being governor those two times, put this up as the Peripheral Canal, which in that time it was just going to be a canal around the delta. It wasn't going to be a tunnel. But these are the voting patterns for this, Proposition 9. And not surprisingly, it pretty much voted geographically with Northern California against it and Southern California for it, and it lost. It did not pass. But there's a little bit of hypocrisy with this, and this political cartoon from that year shows it, in that this is San Francisco depicted in the picture, and this guy's complaining about why those people in Southern California should move to where the water is, whereas people from San Francisco are getting all their water from the Hetch Hetchy, which was this beautiful valley, very similar to Yosemite Valley, that they put a dam on the river and flooded so that folks in San Francisco, and in my area in general, could have nice, clean water. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, I guess you could say, and a lot of sort of myths about California water, some of which I'll cover today. But one of the issues in this proposal, this thing called the co-equal goals, and providing a more reliable water supply to California is really one of the big goals. But coupled with that is protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem. So that's the approach they're trying to take with this Bay Delta Conservation Plan. The Endangered Species Act, and where things really start to become sort of where I get involved in the research I do, and where a lot of the conflict occurs, is that there are endangered species in the Delta, including salmon and those Delta smelt that I mentioned. And the Endangered Species Act is to protect endangered and threatened species and the ecosystems on which they depend. And the Delta would be a perfect example of that. So for all these water projects that are federally run, the whole California water project in general is a combination of state and federal infrastructure. They have to, in order to get permission essentially to operate these projects, they have to make sure that the habitat is not impacted unduly for these endangered species. So President Obama weighed in on this in his State of the Union in 2011. This is one of the things that got a lot of attention after this in the press, is because he said the Interior Department is in charge of salmon while they're in freshwater, but the Commerce Department handles them when they're in saltwater, and I hear that it gets even more complicated once they're smoked. And this was an example of government inefficiency, about how all these different agencies are involved in salmon. And that's just scratching the surface. I mean, when it comes to the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, there are at least 12 more agencies involved. So this is a huge bureaucratic, what's the proper word, situation. And so there's this battle over water in California. And there's been battles over water in California for a long time, but these are just some of the sort of the things you might see. You've got commercial fishermen, sport fishermen on one side, agricultural interests on the other side. If you were driving through the Central Valley, you might see something like this that says, you know, Congress created Dust Bowl. And that might evoke a pretty strong reaction in someone seeing that. You know, why would the government put these farmers out of work by shutting down their water supply? Then there's folks that want to save the Bay Delta, and they're fighting the tunnels, and then same thing over here. So this is a volatile and complex situation. And there's a lot of myths and rhetoric surrounding this. Farmers versus fish, or farmers versus commercial fishers, environmentalists versus business, Northern California versus Southern California, local versus state. But none of these approaches help anybody except for that individual stakeholder trying to use rhetoric or myth to enforce their point of view. This is not the way to effectively look at this. We need water policies that are based on good, solid facts and science. And then Obama was there in California just a couple months ago on Valentine's Day, and when he was asked, because he was there visiting because of the drought, and like I said, we're coming off our second year of really severe drought, and he was there, you know, saying, "Hey, we're here to help." And someone asked him to weigh in on the water debate, and he wasn't going to touch it. Very, very astutely, I think, because there's no way you're going to say anything that's going to please everyone. And that's the reality of the situation. So finally getting to salmon. This is the past 25 years or so of salmon population numbers for the Central Valley. And don't really worry about the colors on the graph. It just shows the number that were taken out of the ocean, the number taken out of the river, plus the number that made it back to the river. And that shows an idea of what the total population looks like each year. You can see it goes up and down. It fluctuates, except for 2007, 2008, there was a collapse of the salmon fishery, or of the salmon populations in the Central Valley. And this was a huge deal. It was so bad that they had to close the fishery for the whole state of California. And that was an unprecedented action. And one of the problems is these salmon come out of rivers all throughout the state and go into the ocean. And once they're in the ocean, you can't, if you're fishing for them, you can't pick and choose which population you take your fish from. So they had to shut down the ocean fishery for the whole state. Now, a huge team got together and looked at all the things that could have contributed to this collapse. And the conclusion was that there were successive years of poor years of ocean conditions. And if you guys remember from that salmon life cycle map I showed you, you know, they spend a lot of their life in the ocean, and that's where they get big. But as they're coming out from the bay, and the ocean conditions are bad, meaning the upwelling conditions, the natural fluctuating ocean conditions are poor for them. There's not a lot of food, they're not going to do well. And through purely natural patterns, there were a couple years like that, and a couple years later, when those adults should have come back, hardly any did. And so if you read that report, or at least the sort of summary headline of that report, you'd say, well, it's ocean conditions, we have no control over that. Pumping and habitat loss and dams, all that has no effect. But of course, if you read the whole report, they go on to say that this is the proximate cause of that collapse. But the ultimate cause has to do with habitat loss and the simplification of the salmon life history, so that they're unable to sustain these sorts of natural fluctuations, which they've been sustaining them for eons, but the current populations aren't able to handle that sort of fluctuation. So this brings me to what the research is really, the direction the research really is moving towards, and that's looking at the entire salmon life cycle. So if you look at it as this big circle here, you know, starting out as eggs in the river, they move to these fry, which are these juvenile stages. They move downstream into the estuary, where they smolt. They go out into the ocean, and then they go back through the estuary, back to the river, and the whole process starts over again. And there's all sorts of things that are impacting them. These are just a few of them. I'm just making the simplified dams, habitat loss in the rivers, pumping in the estuary, lots of habitat loss in the estuary, food web changes in the estuary, fishing pressure in the ocean, not to mention the natural variation in the ocean. So you have to look at it in the context of this whole life cycle, because one change at one part of the life cycle reverberates through to the rest of the life cycle. So I'm going to talk about a few key issues here that we're trying to model to capture what we think is important in salmon population dynamics. Starting with the dams, I already mentioned that. They block access to the ancestral spawning habitat. They totally changed the flow regimes. Instead of the water just naturally flowing from snow melt downstream, it's held up by these dams and then released at the rates that we want to release it. And it drastically changes the temperature in some ways in a beneficial manner, because they're holding this cold water back. And since now the salmon are spawning, in some cases, in the Central Valley where it gets really hot, this cold water can be very helpful. But it is obviously much more complex than that. Then habitat in the delta, this habitat loss that I referred to earlier. You restore habitat in the delta, maybe you spend $100 million restoring habitat in the delta. How do you know that that was effective if, say you restored it, boom, tomorrow, and then all those fish went out in the ocean and didn't make it because of poor ocean conditions? So you have to be able to look at the whole cycle to capture what those effects and the consequences of the effects are. And then the food web changes in the in the delta, where it's an ecosystem that's really in collapse or has mostly collapsed. So the food web doesn't represent what it used to before it was all leveed and diked and dammed. And then, as I said, ocean variability. This is, shows sea surface temperature on the top graph over the last 60 years or so, highly variable. And then this northern oscillation index. I'm not an oceanographer. It just shows that these natural, very large-scale weather patterns really drive how much productivity there will be for those fish as they're coming out. Something we have no control over, but can be highly variable. So what can we do? We have a few knobs and levers we can pull. There's not much we can do about ocean conditions. The only thing we can do in the ocean is restrict fisheries. It's fisheries management. Try and put some limit on how many fish are taken out of the ocean. But we can do a lot about water management with dams, with the pumping in the delta. Hatcheries is a whole another area that I didn't really have time to get into, but that they play an important role. And then habitat restoration. But as I said, you have to look at this in the salmon life cycle in this context. And this requires a highly interdisciplinary approach. Because as I'll show you, it involves more than just looking at one part of the whole situation. It involves hydrology, it involves population modeling, etc. So one of the things that we've done is look at the factors that are important to salmon. In order to create sort of a representation of what's going on, you have to simplify things down to what you think is important and create a model of what we think is really happening. And for our model, we looked at three things: flow, which if you're a fish, you really care about how fast the water is flowing. You have to either swim with it or swim against it, and it makes a big impact on you as an individual, whether it's fast or slow. And then temperature. They're cold-blooded. Their bodies very much their metabolism is very much dependent on the temperature of the water that they're in. And then finally, the amount of food that's available to them to eat. So flow, temperature, and food. I'll be repeating that over and over again here. And so what we are doing with that flow, temperature, and food is putting it in what's called a dynamic energy budget model, which is a bioenergetics model. And it's the same for us as it is for a fish. How warm you are, how much exercise you're doing, and how much food you get will determine how fast you grow, how much you put on weight or lose weight, etc. And the things we're interested in on the other side, that this DEB model will put out, is the growth of the fish, the fecundity, how many eggs they generate, the migration costs, etc. And if you're interested in more of the details, this is still an oversimplification, but basically you've got a fish that's feeding, and it's putting some of those resources towards growing, some of those resources towards maturation, but it's also maintaining itself while it's doing all that. And if it's in really hot water, it's going to have to put a lot more towards maintenance, or if it's swimming up against current, it's going to have to put a lot more into maintenance, etc. So, here's the challenge. You want flow, temperature, and food, which are all very much dynamic and changing in space and time, and you want to do it across rivers, in the estuary, and out in the ocean. This is something like 300 miles of river right here. So this is where things get to be really difficult. And what we're doing is sort of dividing the system up into three parts. We've got the river, and we've got a physical model, and pay no attention to the model names here, it's not important, but physical model in red, and a biological model in green. The physical model will tell us about the water flow and the temperature and those important factors, and the biological model is going to be taking input from that physical model and telling us about what the ecosystem processes are. So in this case, it's going to tell us how much food is available. And then we got another couple set of models for the estuary, because it's a different system, so we have to use slightly different models. And then another set of couple models for the ocean. And then to drive these models, it's a huge geographic area, and as I said, it's constantly changing, and we're using yet another set of models. In this case, this is called COAMS. It's the Coupled Ocean Atmosphere Mesoscale Prediction System. And this is every hour over the course of, I'm not sure, a month or a few days, I can't remember. But that is the latent heat. So that's the heat exchange that's occurring with the environment. And so at nighttime, it's going to turn blue. During the day, things are getting really hot as the land's heating up. And this is telling us of those important driving factors for our physical models over this wide range and at a time step that we need, which is every hour. So if you put them all together, you've got, starting at the top with the water flow, you got the the flow sort of going from model to model, same way that the salmon would go. And they sort of talk to each other, exchanging information throughout the system. And then they're driven by these large-scale weather models, basically. I said coamps here for the land side of things, and then overlapping into the estuary. And the estuary is kind of that land-sea interface. And then we got an ocean model for the ocean part, also going to the estuary. So this is where those two models are sort of interacting. And then the outputs from all those models go into our bioenergetics model and tell us what we want to know about the growth and the fecundity, etc. So now I'll sort of give you an example, stepping through from model to model to model here. This is sort of the starting point for our model system, and this is the Shasta Dam on the Shasta Reservoir. And this is as far as the fish go, so it's a good starting point for us. Somewhere down the line, we want to take it a little further and look at, say, climate change models to see how much difference there might be in the input into Shasta Reservoir, since that's our starting point. That could be really important. You can use other watershed models. But the Shasta Dam is our starting point, and as I said, it feeds into the temperature and the flow out of Shasta feed into our first model, and that is this raft model, which is our physical model for the river. So now we're in the river, and this raft model tells us, with the temperature and the flow leaving Shasta, it will tell us exactly what the temperatures are like downstream in the salmon rearing and egg development habitat. And so we can then go back to the water operators and say, and we can do this in real time, even with forecasting. We say there's a heat wave coming. You're going to have to release more water, or you're going to have to release colder water, because they can control the depth of the water release from the reservoir in order to stay below these threshold temperatures that get too hot for the developing fish. And so the temperature and the flow from that go into this ecosystem model, which is this aquatox model over here, which takes into account important interactions in the river ecosystem, which tells us how much food might be available then to the fish. And as I said, that food goes into the dynamic energy budget model. The flow and the temperature goes into the dynamic energy budget model. So then we can make predictions about how fast those fish are growing under any range of conditions that we care to model. Then we move down with the outputs from those models. We move down to the next set, which is when all this water then reaches the delta, and we've got a physical model for the delta system over here. It's getting a little more complex at this point because these models are more developed than the river models, and they're exchanging more information. But all that water and all that food from the river now enters the delta and enters those models, and we can then use those to populate the DEB model down here for the fish as they're moving into the delta. So say they were going to restore, like I said, 100 acres of habitat within the delta. What difference will that make to the fish that are in the delta? Will that enable them to grow larger? Because the larger they are at the next step when they go into the ocean, the better their chances of survival. And then the final step here is when they go into the ocean. And these models are fairly well developed already. These models have been in use for a number of years. They do a very good job of estimating the physical conditions in the ocean, and and also the amount of food that's available in the ocean. And that is a really dynamic process there. So they can make very good predictions about how well the salmon are going to do once they get into the ocean. But you need to know how big they are when they get into the ocean to really know how well they're going to do. They could say it's a bad year for salmon in the ocean, and if they're all small when they go into the ocean, it's going to be a bad cohort for that year. If half of them are large and half of them are small, the large ones might stand a much better chance. But without knowing what's going on in that previous step, knowing everything about the ocean does not tell a complete story. So that's why we need to know this step, And that's why this step is so much dependent on that step. So in case I haven't beat that to death yet, the whole life cycle is critical for doing salmon population modeling. And I'm not, by no means is this any criticism of any smaller scale studies on salmon, because all this work essentially goes on the back of, or the shoulders of all the work that's been done leading up to this. You can't do any of this without knowing what the specific ecological results of these smaller studies. So some study that's just looking at salmon growth in some small part of the river is necessary for us to be able to have the inputs and understand how these models work at all these upper levels. So this is probably not something that we would have been able to do until relatively recently without all this existing research that has contributed to this process. So in brief summary here, it's a highly complex and highly politicized environment in the Central Valley, and there's excellent work that I believe I put up for the readings for this class by Ellen Hammock and others from the Public Policy Institute of California. And she says the public policy debates are not sufficiently grounded in solid technical and scientific information about how we use and manage water. There's a lot of what is often referred to as sort of combat science, where different stakeholders with their own scientists go head to head with the stakeholders on the other side, and they try and battle it out with, no, your science is wrong, my science is right. And anybody that knows anything about science knows that it's very difficult to be wrong or right in these situations, and that the goal is to or not to reach a consensus, but to move the science forward and to move our understanding forward. And this sort of combative approach does not result in any significant progress. And the salmon life cycle and the flow of water in the Central Valley, and certainly any other salmon system beyond the Central Valley, they're intrinsically linked. They're so tightly linked that you can't have disruptions by dams or massive pumping or habitat loss without there being some consequence to the fish. And I'm not saying that we need to get rid of all the dams or remove the pumping. All these things are probably here to stay. And in fact, in California right now, they're looking for additional storage options, either raising the height of the existing dams or adding additional off-river storage, because California rainfall is so variable. You can have a couple good years and we got more water than we know what to do with, and then following that you have consecutive bad years. And then certainly in geologic time, there have been droughts that have lasted for decades. And that is a scary thought, that if we had a 10-year drought, what the consequences of that might be, but it would not be unprecedented. And then my final sort of conclusion here is that we can use models to look at the impacts of these various management options, climate change options, all sorts of things that we can't look at by direct observation. And these are process-based models, so they are driven sort of from the bottom up by physical and biological conditions that we think are occurring, and allow us to really look at novel conditions that might not be happening yet. So for example, the effects of those massive tunnels that they are potentially going to build in the delta. We can model what those effects would be given the hydrodynamic models that I described for the delta and the subsequent dynamic energy budget models. And then for anyone that is interested in more reading, if you get beyond the 32,000 pages of the BDCP draft, these are three great books that I recommend. Cadillac Desert is probably the most famous, by Mark Reisner. That really sort of brought the whole water culture and wars to people's attention for California. This last one here, which I actually may not have the right cover up there. the Public Policy Institute of California, they have a website, and you can download PDFs of pretty much everything they put out free of charge. And they really cover the whole policy and scientific side of all these issues in an excellent, in bipartisan, I think, manner. And I think that's it. Thank you for your time.
I just wanted to start off with a question for both of you guys, kind of comparing and contrasting the situations you have. I mean, in the one case, you've got a highly structured, human-made environment, and on the other hand, you've got kind of a natural ecosystem, and in both cases, you're trying to manage this. Can you use similar techniques in both these cases, or does history play such a huge role that where we are today is going to demand fundamentally different responses, do you think?
I defer to my senior co-speaker here.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Not having the expertise in David's system, I would approach it by saying that I wouldn't say the prevailing view for California water and the salmon delta ecosystem is that it's so fundamentally changed from what it was, pre-gold rush days. So the two maps that I showed, the two contrasting maps over the two time periods, that we're never going to make it back to that habitat. It's just not going to happen. And by shooting for that as our target, we're setting an unrealistic, unachievable goal. And so we have to sort of shift the baseline to something that's more realistic, that is attainable, and work from there. And one of the reasons that I didn't have time to go into was that during the gold rush, where that's when the population of California really started to increase, the hydraulic mining, I actually don't know how they did it, but they managed to get water through gravity or whatever into hoses, into these basic fire hose nozzles, and just blasted away entire hillsides. And in that process, all the mine tailings and all the water would wash out into the streams, and they could more easily access the gold that way. But all that sediment and this went on for decades, and all that sediment washed downstream and essentially filled up the delta. And so you're not going to get all that to move out. And even if you start to break some levees and try to return some of that habitat, it would take so long, geologic time to return it to its previous state. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but it's really more a matter of
well, no, it phrases it in an interesting way. So I guess the part of the question is what's the goal then? I mean, is it necessarily to get it back to what the natural situation is, or is it to work within the constraints? I mean, the Dutch now have this new program called Room for the River, where they're really kind of expanding the boundaries which they're going to let the river meander, and so they're just saying we're just going to give this amount to the river. But in the cases, especially where it's not already constrained, what are you going to do?
I'll give another non-answer to go. And the sort of getting it back to natural or not, I think is not realistic, because natural is having megafauna, in your system, right? And they structured how the energy moved through the system and what have you, and we're not bringing them back. So if that's the natural state, then the easiest way to answer that question is no. So then we're sort of shifting our sort of baseline down, and we can go back to what was natural 200 years ago. I would say it's kind of like when I was looking for a house when I moved up here a year ago, and I would see a lot of homes that were renovated with no plan long term. They would just do a little thing here and a little thing there and a little thing there, and by the time they were finished with it, they just had this home that was built 200 years ago, but now it was just a scarred, fragile, piece of home. Meanwhile, you go to another house that is just the way it was, with maybe minor nips and tucks there, and that is solid. And I feel kind of like looking at the California situation, you're looking much more at a sort of herky-jerky sort of house of cards, right? And it's going to be much harder to take that back to anything natural than it would be to Apalachicola, which it has been modified. It has dams, it's been dredged. As a result, it's now deeper. And so when the rains, the fresh water does come in and it rains, it takes much more water to fill the channel and to have it overflow into the wetlands, where you have all these trees that love water and they make you Tupelo honey. So I'm not trying to say Apalachicola system is not modified, it is, but it's much less modified than California. But even with that being the case, I don't think you're going to get 4 million people in Atlanta to stop. You're from Atlanta, right?
Once upon a time.
Okay. I don't think you're going to get them to stop using water. So given that we're closer to a more natural state in Florida than we are in California, I still think that we need to adjust our expectations. And even if we did let the water come down freely, and we just said, Georgia, you get nothing, I mean, the climate was changing. You saw it on the Atlantic coast of Florida, what is happening, and there's no water diversion there. So things are changing naturally.
All right. I've got a bunch of questions, but I want to give a chance for the audience to ask them. Anybody have one? Do you have one in the back? Or are you just doing your hair? Okay. Go ahead.
At the chance of potentially continuing on the same topic, I was interested in the concept of how extremely highly organized and managed your system is, and how it's been, all of the dams have made it very specifically organized, and the potential for managing in two kind of general categories of either managing in that same sort of way, where you're very technically managing details of how it all works and making it the right temperatures at the right times and all that sort of thing, or attempting to go back, kind of like what you guys were talking about, back to just letting it be natural. And at what extent you go too far into the technical management, and at what extent you should pull back and be more natural.
All right, so I'm just going to repeat this for the sake of the camera. So if I can paraphrase, the question is that you've got a highly managed system and you've got a lot of technical know-how, but that means that you also then have to control all those different parameters. So what's the relative advantages of having a system where you understand how it works and you know the little dials and needles and you can control it versus just letting it go naturally? Does that give it the gist of what you're asking?
That's actually better way of saying it.
Well, that's an excellent question, and when I say that, what I mean is I hate it when people ask questions like that. No, it was very perceptive, because at the end I did say that part about, we can then tell the dam managers exactly how much water, and I was mixing my stories a little bit there, and so there are two different things, and one of them is modeling the entire system to look at the effects of some particular management strategy, and that's the overall goal of what we're doing. The telling the dam managers what to do is more the triage level of, you have endangered species that have habitat right below the dam, and we're just trying to keep those guys alive at the moment. So one of the critical parts of that is making sure the temperatures don't rise above this agreed upon threshold. So they're very different things, but you're absolutely right. The micromanaging is not the ultimate solution to this system. There's a lot of work on what are called environmental flows, where you're trying to return things to a more variable system, which would reflect the more natural hydrodynamics of the system. And I think that is maybe ultimately the answer, but it's really at opposite ends of all the things we do like about the managed water system. The constant, reliable delivery of water, the hydropower electricity, the minimizing flooding. These are very different goals, and they're probably not mutually attainable in many respects. There would have to be some very creative solutions to get around that, where you dedicate some sections of habitat that are outside of that control, and then other parts that are still part of that overall water conveyance. But like I said, no, that might have not been the best example for this particular system, because it is sort of it's implying that we have the technological capability of making the system perfect, or working towards perfection, and there are no ultimate technological fixes for this. All we can do at this point is model the consequences of these actions, and then try and incrementally move forward.
What?
Yeah, I'll just add to that and say the situation in California is it's just a beast that now you're having to turn dials and everything because of the past. So there's no choice really. But I hope that through increasing knowledge that we gain through science, that we can ultimately convince people that perhaps a more passive management approach might be the way to go. If we can show that the net outcome, yeah, there's going to be pain, but if we can somehow provide bulletproof evidence that the net outcome for the most amount of people will be positive, if we go through more passive management schemes and kind of go with the flow instead of swimming upstream, I hope that's ultimately where we get to.
Yeah, I love your question, because a lot of this is our tolerance for variability and extremes, and a lot of times they're going to be trade-offs. I mean, I'm thinking of coastal armoring, that if we have, no tolerance for any flooding whatsoever, and we build huge walls, okay, great, we're not going to be flooded, but what's that going to do to us on a daily basis? And there's an interesting example of that going on in Japan right now, where they're building these huge seawalls, and people are getting really angry because that means they can't see the ocean, they can't get out to their fishing sites, and so it's making them really armored against extreme events. But what's it do to you on a daily basis? And I think it's exactly what you're getting at is, all right, what's your tolerance for one bad flood event every 20 years, and what's your tolerance for not being able to see the ocean when you live on the coast?
From a multiple stakeholder perspective, do you think putting a monetary value on sort of these worst case scenarios or trade-offs actually helps anything, or does it make it for more sort of infighting, more claiming of money and territory?
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat it. So the question is, if you put a dollar value on things like ecosystem services and all the different things you're trying to manage, does it make it better or worse for multiple stakeholders and looking at trade-offs? Yeah.
Sure.
You're going to think? Yeah.
I would say there's only one way to know, and that's to try it. We're all one big experiment, right? And what we're doing now isn't working. But I think that's sort of the frontier for my field, is taking these little stat results that pop up and putting it in a currency that you guys care about, and that's dollars. And that's ultimately what everyone's arguing about, I would say. So I think that would be a promising approach. Can't tell you it's going to work or not, but there's only one way to find out.
Yeah, that's really outside of my area of expertise. And I agree with David that the common currency part is important. It also can be pretty eye-opening, and depending on your perspective, really work against you. I don't have the numbers, but I've heard quotes about the cost of protecting salmon, say on the Columbia River, per capita, and it comes out to, and since I'm being recorded, I'm not going to throw it out there, but some really high number per fish that is ridiculous. And if you put it in those terms, it's like, well, if I'm buying salmon for $5 a pound or whatever, but it's costing 3 orders of magnitude more than that to protect them, and it's a really a value-laden policy question. How much do we care about a species going extinct? And I might care a lot more than the next person.
So since both your systems, you had said it's drought conditions and it's fight for water essentially is in California and Florida, and then obviously having cascading effects on these ecosystems, how much of that water is actually being used by the layperson, by the general individual that lives in Atlanta, versus water waste through proper management issues or other non-developed agricultural practices that, like, is that the issue that we need to address on managing our fresh water to then have better cascade effects on our estuaries and deltas? Or, like, what is that first step for a policy, if this is a public policy kind of?
So if I summarize this, drought's the problem. Is it everyday people who are creating it, or is it other things?
Sure.
Well, one thing I want to clarify, maybe it was Brian's interpretation, is drought is exacerbating the problem, but by no means is it the driver. We would still have these problems in California whether there was a drought or not, and most of the climate change projections, which are highly variable and uncertain, most of them are towards less snow melt and more rainfall in terms of precipitation, which would make it much more flashy in terms of when the water comes. In the long term, drought is not necessarily the issue. But getting back to your original question, efficiency and conservation measures are definitely part of the whole picture, the whole sort of portfolio of what needs to be done. But by no means can we get there purely on conservation and efficiency alone. The agricultural industry has made major progress in how they use water so that it's more efficient. And they're working with scientists on reducing the amount of water loss to evapotranspiration during really hot periods, and just the general use of the water has improved both in ag and in the urban areas, in households. Southern Californians are really very good about how much water they use. Ironically, the city of Sacramento, which is sort of the area where they used to flood all the time, something like, I don't know what the percentage is, half the households don't even meter the water. And if you're not even metered and you're just paying a flat rate, there's no incentive to conserve. I mean, I care a lot about water issues, but if I wasn't being metered, I probably wouldn't be as good about it as I would if I was. So this is, and they're changing this, but this is slowly occurring throughout the Central Valley. But yeah, water conservation is part of the picture, but by no means the whole picture.
Agreed. Yeah, they call this strategy in Florida and Georgia the water-long vigilantes. So that's the idea of Floridians traveling up to Atlanta and casing a particular yard and saying, "Oh, you use too much water." That's not going to work. And I'm not from Georgia and I don't have the data, but I'm from North Carolina, so I think I know the mindset. And I would say that the conservation trend probably hasn't quite taken root. So I would say that conservation would be a good thing to focus on there, but it's not going to solve everything. It would just be one small piece of the solution puzzle. And I think that it's probably harder to convince users who have been using things for a long time, as opposed to perhaps taking our research and doing outreach targeted at youth. So focusing on education, perhaps to instill a conservation ethic for the next generation would probably be more passive approach.
It just seems to me in what you're doing, you're working the areas, and he was too, where the freshwater rivers come into the saltwater. Now that happens a lot on the United States, where the freshwater rivers hit the saltwater. I lived in Newburyport, and the Merrimack River hits the saltwater, the freshwater hits the saltwater. But there's, down by, I'm just wondering, okay, my general question is, I'm just wondering, since there's so many places where the freshwater hits the saltwater, when we come up with a solution that works somewhere, couldn't we use that kind of solution in other places?
So just again for the camera, bear with me. So if I'm understanding your question, it's that there are lots of places where we have freshwater entering into the ocean. So is one goal here that if we can find a solution that works in one place, potentially adapt it to many other places, so not just focus on these large areas, but all the different areas where you've got a delta. It's not an easy question.
Yeah, that's,
That was a great question.
Yeah.
And so I'll be the politician and not really answer it, right? So in my field, we call this context-dependent conditions. And so you have two species interacting over here in one environment, and it's wet, right? And so over here, it's a wet environment, and you have the same two species interacting, but something's a little different. And so the way those two species interacting differs here than over there. So getting back to your specific question, I don't think that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all solution, but I do think it would be instructive to, just like in our research, when something does work over here, do try it over here, and then tinker with it, experiment, and you got to start somewhere. And if it does work out great, now we're building up support for this one-size-fits-all. If it doesn't, well then we'll need to know why, and that'll lead to the next step.
I thought that was a very good answer. The same things would apply in our cases. For salmon, there are a lot of different life history approaches or a lot of different physical environments. So there are coastal salmon that they don't have an estuarine stage. They come out of the coastal mountains, and boom, they hit the ocean. There's no estuarine, no sort of brackish water, and so obviously the model would have to be substantially adapted to handle those sort of conditions. In many cases, those systems are also a lot more pristine, or I should say a lot less altered than what's going on in the Central Valley. The Central Valley is really, it's the big gun in the system, but it's also the most altered.
Yes?
This question's for Eric. So I'm really interested in your talk and what happened with the salmon and everything. I was wondering if you could share some of the strategies you would use with the politicians or with any kind of public service about how you would change some of the flow, temperature, and food that could help your salmon, which is a high impact animal, kind of sexy species that we work with, to help help increase your fisheries or your hatcheries. Because having that tunnel being built, you're essentially lowering the flow through the Sacramento River, maybe affecting your DEV model, maybe affecting your fish. So do you guys have some kind of implement that's going on that could actually push towards, hey, we need more flow towards the river, we can't really have everything go through the tunnel?
So what advice would you provide to decision makers based on your model in terms of what they can do if they build this tunnel, or I guess if they don't? Is that fair?
Yeah, what kind of strategies?
Strategies, yeah.
Not advice.
Well, in case I didn't mention it, I'm here as a individual citizen. So I wouldn't personally have any sort of strategy. No, in all seriousness, the way the NOAA fisheries is set up is actually it's very relevant to this question in that the Science Center, where I happen to be employed, we do sort of research on these sorts of issues. And then distinct from us is a policy branch of NOAA fisheries called the, I'm trying to blank here. So it's an entirely separate sort of wing of the agency, and that's intentional, and that is to make sure that the science and the policy are distinct and that they don't influence each other, and so that people don't influence me as a scientist, and I don't have any sort of direct interaction with the stakeholders, if that makes sense. And it sounds, I don't want to make it sound sort of ivory towerish, but it's an intentional firewall to keep the science and the policy distinct. That wasn't a very good description, but I think you get the idea. However, to answer your question though, at this point, I really wouldn't have any specific suggestions or recommendations to make once we do get the model going. And what I probably would really make clear is that we're not there yet. We don't actually have any model results to show. But in the next few years, when we start generating results, in fact, it may be that the tunnels have no effect or no detrimental effect on salmon. We just don't know yet. But all we can do is say, this is what our best estimate of the impacts will be, and let the science stand for itself.